What happens when Hollywood royalty sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to face disrespect so shocking it forces a legend to walk off set in front of a live studio audience? In just 31 seconds of one careless comment, Jennifer Hudson went from daytime talk show host to the person who made Morgan Freeman stand up and leave her show forever. The audience had no idea what was coming. They were settled into their seats, ready for another feel-good afternoon of celebrity stories and laughter. Morgan Freeman, the voice that had narrated countless films and brought dignity to every role he ever touched, walked onto the stage with that familiar, warm smile. The applause was deafening. This was supposed to be easy. A quick chat about his latest project, maybe some stories from his legendary career, and everyone goes home happy. Jennifer Hudson stood to greet him, her smile bright under the studio lights. They hugged briefly, the kind of professional embrace you see 1,000 times on these shows. Morgan settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket, completely unaware that this interview was about to become the most uncomfortable moment of his career. "Morgan Freeman, everybody," Jennifer said to another round of applause. "Thank you so much for being here. I have been wanting to sit down with you for so long." "Well, I'm happy to be here," Morgan replied, his voice carrying that signature calm warmth. "Thank you for having me." The first few minutes went fine. They talked about his childhood, growing up in Mississippi, how he discovered his love for acting. Morgan told a charming story about his first school play, and the audience laughed in all the right places. Jennifer seemed engaged, nodding along, asking follow-up questions. Everything looked normal. But then something shifted. "So, Morgan," Jennifer said, leaning forward in her chair with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I have to ask you something that I think everyone wants to know." Morgan nodded politely. "Sure. Go ahead." "You've been in this industry for, what, like 100 years now?" Jennifer laughed at her own joke. A few audience members gave uncomfortable chuckles. Morgan's expression barely changed, but if you were watching closely, you could see his jaw tighten just slightly. "Well, I wouldn't say quite that long," he said, keeping his tone light. "But I've been fortunate to work for many decades, yes." Right, Jennifer waved her hand dismissively. "But seriously, at your age, do you ever think about just, retiring? Giving some of the younger actors a chance?" The audience went quiet. That uncomfortable kind of quiet, where everyone knows something inappropriate just happened, but nobody wants to acknowledge it. Morgan sat back in his chair, studying Jennifer's face. "I'm sorry. Are you asking me when I plan to stop working?" "I mean, not to be rude or anything," Jennifer said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly how rude she was being. "But there are so many talented young black actors out there who could use the opportunities. Don't you think you've had your time?" The camera caught Morgan's expression perfectly. Disbelief mixed with disappointment. He blinked slowly, taking a moment to process what he'd just heard. "That's an interesting perspective," he said carefully. "I wasn't aware that my continuing to work was taking opportunities away from anyone." Jennifer laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, come on, you know what I mean. It's just that Hollywood has a diversity problem, and maybe if some of the older generation stepped aside—" "The older generation," Morgan repeated, his voice still calm, but now carrying an edge. "Is that what you're calling me?" "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking," Jennifer said, shrugging. "No offense, but you've had an amazing career. Maybe it's time to let fresh faces shine." The audience was completely silent now. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The energy in the room had gone from celebratory to painfully awkward in a matter of minutes. Morgan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Jennifer. "Let me ask you something. When you look at me, do you see an actor, or do you see an old man who's in your way?" Jennifer seemed taken aback by the directness of the question. I see a legendary actor, of course, but you think I should stop," Morgan finished for her. You think that me continuing to do what I love, what I've dedicated my entire life to, is somehow a problem. That's not exactly what Jennifer started, but Morgan wasn't finished. Do you ask Meryl Streep when she's going to retire? Do you ask Robert De Niro to step aside for younger actors? Or is this a question you reserve for people who look like me? Jennifer's face flushed. Now wait a minute, that's not fair. I'm just trying to have an honest conversation about representation in Hollywood. Honest? Morgan's voice rose slightly, though he still maintained his composure. There's nothing honest about suggesting that I'm taking opportunities from younger actors simply by existing and working. That's not how this industry works, and you know it. I think you're being a little sensitive, Jennifer said, and the audience audibly gasped. She'd crossed a line, and everyone knew it. Morgan stared at her for a long moment. Sensitive, he repeated quietly. You invite me onto your show. Ask me insulting questions about my age and my career. Suggest that I'm standing in the way of progress. And when I respond with dignity, I'm being sensitive. Look, Morgan, I didn't mean to upset you, Jennifer said, but her tone was defensive rather than apologetic. I'm just keeping it real. That's what my show is about. Keeping it real, Morgan said, nodding slowly. Is that what you call disrespecting your guests? Jennifer's eyes narrowed. Disrespecting? I think you're overreacting. I'm trying to have a real conversation here, not just blow smoke. If you can't handle a few tough questions, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. The audience was frozen. Nobody could believe what they were hearing. This wasn't playful banter or a spirited debate. This was a host attacking her guest on live television. Morgan sat completely still, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but firm. Let me tell you something about respect. When you invite someone onto your show, especially someone who has been in this business longer than you've been alive, you treat them with basic courtesy. You don't ambush them with ageist comments. You don't suggest they're past their prime. You don't tell them to step aside. I never said you were past your prime, Jennifer protested. You implied it, Morgan shot back. Every word out of your mouth since we started talking about my career has implied that I'm too old, that I've had my turn, that I should disappear. Do you have any idea how insulting that is? Jennifer crossed her arms. I think you're putting words in my mouth. I was just asking questions that people want answered. What people? Morgan asked. Who are these people who supposedly want me to retire? Or is that just you? It's not just me, Jennifer insisted. There are articles, think pieces, conversations happening about how Hollywood keeps recycling the same old actors instead of giving new talent a chance. And you thought this was the appropriate venue to confront me about that? Morgan's voice was incredulous now. You thought ambushing me on your talk show was the right move. Jennifer stood up from her chair, clearly agitated. I'm not ambushing anyone. This is my show, and I can ask whatever questions I want. If you don't like it, maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on. The audience murmured. Some people shook their heads. This was spiraling out of control. Morgan stood up too, and the studio went dead silent. He looked at Jennifer for a long moment, then looked out at the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. I came here today expecting a professional interview. Instead, I've been insulted, dismissed, and told that I'm standing in the way of progress simply because I continue to work. Oh, please, Jennifer said, rolling her eyes. You're being dramatic. Dramatic? Morgan's voice finally showed real anger. You have spent the last 10 minutes questioning my right to continue my career. You've made this interview about my age instead of my work. And now you're dismissing my very reasonable objection to your behavior as me being dramatic. I think you're taking this way too personally, Jennifer said. It's not about you specifically. It's about the industry. Then why am I sitting here being interrogated about it? Morgan asked. Why did you invite me onto your show if you have such a problem with actors my age continuing to work? Jennifer threw her hands up. Because people want to hear from you, but they also want honest conversations, not just fluff pieces where everyone pretends everything is perfect. There's a difference between an honest conversation and an attack, Morgan said quietly. And what you've done here today is attack me under the guise of honesty. I haven't attacked anyone, Jennifer protested. You're just mad because I asked questions you didn't want to answer. Morgan shook his head slowly. No, I'm disappointed because I expected better from you. I expected respect. I expected professionalism. Instead, you've shown me that you care more about creating controversy than treating your guests with dignity. That is so unfair, Jennifer said, her voice rising. I have been nothing but respectful. Respectful? Morgan's eyebrows rose. You asked me if I've considered retiring. You suggested I'm taking opportunities from younger actors. You called me part of the older generation, like it's a disease. You told me I was being sensitive when I objected. Which part of that was respectful? The audience began to applaud, softly at first, then louder. They were applauding Morgan, not Jennifer. Her face went red. Are you seriously turning my audience against me? Jennifer demanded. I'm not doing anything, Morgan said calmly. Your audience is responding to what they've witnessed. They've watched you disrespect a guest, and they're letting you know how they feel about it. Jennifer looked out at the audience, many of whom were now on their feet, still applauding. This is unbelievable, she muttered. What's unbelievable, Morgan said, is that you still don't seem to understand what you've done wrong. I haven't done anything wrong, Jennifer insisted. I asked legitimate questions. You asked insulting questions, Morgan corrected. There's a difference. A legitimate question would be about my current project, my creative process, my experiences in the industry. What you did was question my right to continue working. Jennifer's jaw tightened. You know what? If you're going to be this sensitive, maybe you should just leave. The studio gasped collectively. The audacity of what she just said hung in the air like smoke. Morgan stared at her for a beat, then nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. I should leave. I should never have come here in the first place. He began to walk toward the edge of the stage. Jennifer seemed to realize she'd made a terrible mistake. Wait, Morgan, come on, she called after him. Don't be like this. We can finish the interview. Morgan stopped and turned back to face her. Finish the interview? After you just told me to leave? After you've spent the entire time insulting me? Why would I stay? Because walking off makes you look bad, Jennifer said, and even she seemed to realize how awful that sounded the moment it left her mouth. Morgan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'd rather look bad, for walking away from disrespect, than look bad for tolerating it. So that's it? Jennifer said. You're just going to storm off? I'm not storming anywhere, Morgan said quietly. I'm leaving with my dignity intact, which is more than I can say for this interview. The audience erupted in applause again, many people now standing and cheering. Jennifer stood alone on her stage, watching as one of the greatest actors of all time walked away from her show. This is ridiculous, Jennifer said to the audience, trying to regain control. He's being completely unreasonable. But the audience wasn't having it. Some people were booing now. Others were shaking their heads. A few were already heading for the exits themselves. Morgan reached the side of the stage where the crew stood. He shook hands with a few of them, thanked them for their professionalism, and disappeared backstage. The whole studio could hear Jennifer's voice carrying through the space. Okay, well, I guess that's how some people handle tough questions, she said, trying to sound casual, but her voice was shaking. Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. But the damage was done. The audience continued to file out during the commercial break. The energy in the studio had gone from celebratory to hostile. Production assistants scrambled around, trying to figure out how to salvage the show. Backstage, Morgan was already removing his microphone, handing it to a sound technician with a polite thank you. His publicist rushed over, phone already in hand, ready to do damage control. I'm fine, Morgan told her calmly. "I have nothing to apologize for." And he didn't. He'd walked onto that stage as a respected actor and legend. He'd left as a man who refused to be disrespected, regardless of the cameras, the audience, or the host's misguided attempt at edgy television. Jennifer tried to continue with her show after the break, but her remaining audience was cold. The next guest, a young comedian, had apparently witnessed what happened from backstage and decided to cancel their appearance. Jennifer ended up doing a solo segment, talking about her upcoming projects, but nobody was really listening anymore. The studio audience that remained sat in uncomfortable silence. The applause was sparse and obligatory. The energy that makes daytime talk shows work, that connection between host and audience, had been completely severed. What Jennifer failed to understand, what she'd learned too late, was that respect isn't negotiable. It doesn't matter if you're the host or the guest, famous or unknown, young or old. When you invite someone onto your platform and then use that platform to belittle them, you've violated a fundamental rule of human decency. Morgan Freeman had built a career on dignity, on bringing gravitas and humanity to every role he played. He'd earned his place in Hollywood through decades of exceptional work, not by tearing others down or creating controversy for its own sake. When faced with someone who seemed to value shock over substance, he did the only thing that made sense. He walked away. The interview lasted less than 20 minutes from start to finish, but those 20 minutes revealed everything you need to know about character. Morgan showed his by refusing to engage with disrespect. Jennifer showed hers by doubling down on her insulting questions, by dismissing valid objections, and ultimately by telling her guest to leave when he dared to push back. In the green room afterward, Morgan sat quietly, completely composed. He'd faced down far worse than an unprofessional talk show host. He'd navigated an industry that hadn't always welcomed him, that had put obstacles in his path, that had tried to limit him to certain types of roles. He'd overcome all of it with talent, perseverance, and dignity. One poorly conceived interview wasn't going to change any of that. His publicist finished making calls, coordinating with his team about the best way to handle the situation. But Morgan wasn't worried about spin or damage control. He knew the truth. Anyone who watched that interview would see exactly what happened. A host had disrespected her guest, and the guest had responded by refusing to participate in his own humiliation. Meanwhile, back in the studio, Jennifer's producers were in panic mode. They knew they had a disaster on their hands. Social media was already exploding with reactions. Clips of the interview were being shared everywhere, and the narrative wasn't going Jennifer's way. People weren't praising her for asking tough questions. They were condemning her for being rude and dismissive. They were celebrating Morgan for standing up for himself. The very controversy Jennifer seemed to crave had backfired spectacularly. What she'd failed to calculate was that audiences have a strong sense of fairness. They can tell the difference between a challenging interview and a hostile one. They can recognize when a host crosses the line from provocative to disrespectful. And they don't like seeing someone they admire being treated poorly, especially when that person handles it with the kind of grace Morgan displayed. The thing about Morgan Freeman is that he's never needed to be the loudest person in the room. He's never relied on controversy or shock value. His presence alone commands respect. His body of work speaks for itself. When Jennifer tried to diminish that, tried to suggest he was past his relevance, she wasn't just insulting him. She was insulting every person who's ever been told they're too old, too experienced, too much of whatever arbitrary quality someone decides disqualifies them from doing what they love. And that's why the audience turned on her. Because they recognized themselves in Morgan's position. They'd all been dismissed, underestimated, or disrespected at some point. Watching him refuse to accept that treatment felt like validation. The walk from the guest chair to the exit couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it represented something much larger. It was a statement about self-worth, about knowing when to walk away, about refusing to let anyone make you feel less than you are. Jennifer called after him, tried to frame his departure as an overreaction, attempted to paint herself as the victim of an oversensitive guest. But none of it stuck. The cameras had captured everything. The audience had witnessed it all. There was no spinning this into anything other than what it was. A host who'd bitten off more than she could chew, and a guest who'd had the self-respect to walk away. As Morgan left the building, got into his car, and drove away from the studio, he felt nothing but peace. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't called Jennifer names. He hadn't made a scene. He'd simply stated his case, clearly and calmly, and when it became obvious that continuing the conversation would serve no purpose, he'd left. That's what dignity looks like. Not shouting or fighting, or trying to get the last word. Just knowing your worth and acting accordingly. Jennifer would have to deal with the aftermath of her choices. The think pieces would be written. The social media debates would rage on. Her producers would have crisis meetings about the show's direction. But none of that was Morgan's problem. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd shown up prepared for a professional interview and encountered unprofessionalism. His response was appropriate and measured. The lesson here, if there is one, is simple. Respect is earned through how you treat others, especially when you have power over them. As a talk show host, Jennifer had the power of the platform, the audience, the cameras. She could have used that power to have a meaningful conversation with a legendary actor. Instead, she used it to grandstand and create controversy. And she learned, in the most public way possible, that power without respect is worthless.